A shrinking number of companies seem to want to do business with the federal government, especially small businesses. Could it be all of the reporting and compliance requirements? There's one class of compliance that is particularly tricky, as we hear from the founder and CEO of PROCAS, Jim Wesloh. Jim, good to have you with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
For someone that went through the trouble of finding government opportunities, deciding they want to do this, and then bidding and winning, what should they have in place already to be able to fulfill a contract that is unique and different from what is normally expected in the private sector?
Well, we focus on government contract accounting, including timekeeping, expense reports, the entire general ledger, and project management and project reports. And we're going to focus particularly on timekeeping right now. A lot of new owners might be used to working in a commercial organization where they can just fill out their timesheets at the end of the week and turn them in. They might think that's fine. There are some additional requirements for government contracting. For example, they're going to want to make sure that everybody does their timesheet every day. You might say, why can't I just wait till the end of the pay period? Well, just like you might hear on the news that people need to have contemporaneous recording of thoughts when things happen to justify them, it's the same with timekeeping. If you wait 2 weeks, you might not remember what you did. And so that's the only justification that you actually have for the work that you did.
And just because the government says so, yes. You have to do it every day.
Yes. So the Federal Acquisition Regulations is the body of law that governs purchasing from the government. And it says that you need to make sure that you can justify your expenses. And then the Defense Contract Audit Agency will audit contracts not only for defense contractors, but often for other agencies also. You must follow their rules.
Sure. And it's safe to say, too, that the DCAA could come at you 6 years later and look into a contract. And oops. So that gets to the idea of keeping time and keeping records for a long time.
Yes.
In a manner that you can reproduce them?
Yes. And the other thing is some new government contractors might think, well, can I just record time or do the accounting for my government programs and not worry about commercial contracts if they had the commercial contracts before? And the answer is no. If you're a government contractor, everything falls within the scope of the audits, because things that you do on the commercial contracts will also affect the government contracts. You have direct costs that are for a particular project, but you also have indirect costs that are allocated across contracts, both government and commercial. So you have to establish your base, which would be like the denominator of a fraction, to show how much needs to be going to the commercial contracts and the government contracts. So you have to record time for all your contracts and also your indirect expenses, your overhead and your general administrative expenses, as well as your paid time off and holiday. Those also get allocated to your government contracts and your commercial contracts.
So a standard commercial system for accounting of all of that then would not be adequate for government contracts.
That's right. In commercial contracting, you might hear of companies having overhead. That's generally just all the costs that aren't going directly to the jobs. In government contracting, they want to have you split out overhead that supports contracts and general administrative costs that are necessary to run the business but don't really help your projects. And then they might also want you to break out fringe benefits in addition to base salary that would support your employees and potentially facilities costs they want you to track, and then bid and proposal costs and independent research and development costs. And about a quarter of the government contractors may also have a value-added situation where they have a lot of subcontractors or materials, and they would want to record subcontract administration or material handling costs as separate indirect costs. So that's a lot more elaborate, and you have to then be able to calculate your indirect rates and apply them to your job. So much more complicated than for a commercial organization.
We're speaking with Jim Wesloh, the founder and CEO of PROCAS. So that gets complicated, as you say. For example, if you have administrative help and it costs you $1 million a year to maintain it for your company, then you have to allocate that portion of administrative costs to what it is you're doing for the government. And that gets down to specific hours. And it's almost like you have to guess at some point. I mean, is there allowable limits within all of these different elements that you have to allocate toward your federal contract such that there's some matchup between what you actually spent and what went toward supporting that particular effort?
So you'll record the cost for the projects, and you'll record, for example, your administrative costs. And if you have a cost plus fixed fee contract, in theory, you get reimbursed for all of your costs. But in practical purposes, there might be a cap on your contract value. And so if you said you were going to spend $1 million on direct costs and $500,000 on indirect costs, and you had this is a very simplified version of an indirect rate, you have a 50% indirect rate, but then you spent $750,000. If it was above the contract value, you wouldn't be able to be reimbursed for the additional costs.
Right, so you have to have proportionality in what it is you're allocating from your overall costs to your federal contract costs.
Yes. So in very simplified terms, if a quarter of your projects were government and a quarter of the projects and costs were commercial, then you'd have 25% going to the government and 75% going to the commercial. That's a very simplified version of this. It gets much more complicated than that.
Sure. And suppose you have like a really expensive administrative assistant that is maybe paid more than the people that you have working on the contract for the government. Is that likely to cause a problem? Your hourly administrative costs that you're allocating to this are higher than your direct cost to the person doing the work, the programming.
They want to look for reasonableness, and if you have a situation where you're paying an administrative assistant much more than the people working in the jobs, it's probably a situation where it's a family or friend, and they're probably going to say no, that's not an allowable cost, that it's the position doesn't justify that, so it's not reasonable to be paying that much.
Right. If you're paying, say, you want to have 8A status or women-owned status, and so you make your wife the ostensible person, that wife can't also be the administrative assistant taking $500,000 out of the business in salary, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that would be unreasonable and unacceptable. So getting back to somebody who's thinking about getting into government contracting, in particular some of the emphasis that they should be thinking about for timekeeping. People have to record their time every day. If it's a digital system, they have to be a unique user login so other people can't get in and do your time for you. If you make a change, there has to be an audit trail of the changes with a reason for the change. And at the end of the period, they have to certify it, and then a supervisor has to approve it. So these are just some basic elements that you must have. And if you don't have a system that can handle that, then the Defense Contract Audit Agency or some other auditor might come in and say that these costs are not justified, they're not allowable, we have no confidence in them, so the government may not reimburse you for them. So you might not get paid on your contracts.
Right. And the government, by the way, don't they also have the right to certify or approve of the accounting system that you use before you use it on a contract?
Yes, there's a standard form 1408 that's basically a checklist of things that you need an accounting system to do. And some of those things are an adequate timekeeping system, an adequate accounting system. The accounting system has to generally follow generally accepted accounting principles, including doing accrual accounting and not cash accounting that most companies will start out doing and is okay for tax purposes, but they want to have accrual accounting. And they want to make sure that time is recorded every day, and that they can allocate the time to the different cost objectives. We talked about the direct, the overhead, the G&A, the fringe facilities, material handling, subcontract administration, BNP, and R&D. They will check and make sure you have an adequate accounting system.
So you have to have that in place before you really bid if you're going to be able to have any success.
Yeah, they'll come in and often do a pre-award audit of your accounting system, and they want to make sure that you have something in place ready to go. If you're not operating it already, if you're a commercial company not operating it, they want to make sure you actually do have it set up to be ready to go if you win the contract.
Well, two quick questions. Does the cost of adding that system capability, does that qualify as a reimbursable cost?
Yeah, that is an allowable cost through your G&A rate. So you can find a system and implement it, and those costs would be allowable according to the Federal Acquisition Regulations.
And I don't know much about the accounting software market, but do the large or the popular commercial programs have federal extensions available to them in general?
A couple of them do, but generally they're rather awkward to get the data to go back and forth because you'd have to have all your costs in the general ledger, and then you would have to have a way to do these indirect rates with all these different cost pools. And then you have to come up with the rates for those different pools, and then you need to be able to allocate those costs back to all the contracts. And so that gets complicated when that's in two different systems. So it's much easier if you have a system that's purpose-built for government contracting.
And I guess those programs then can work backwards toward purely commercial customers too?
Yes, there's nothing in government contracting that would preclude someone from using the government contracting system for commercial work, but the commercial systems are not adequate for doing